Okay, so I want to start off talking about neuron physiology. This is project 1 of Psych 325. So a couple things to start off that you're going to want to know these important terms. Just as we talk about neuron physiology, these are really important. Membrane potential, that is the difference in electrical potential between the inside and outside of the cell. And then we have the resting potential. This is the difference between the inside and outside when nothing is really going on. So depolarization is when we get that movement of ions towards zero from the resting potential, and then hyperpolarization is the resting potential is becoming more negative, so you're getting away from the zero. So depolarization is going towards zero, hyperpolarization is going more negative away from zero. Action potential is the brief electrical impulse providing the basis for conduction of information along an axon. We're going to be talking about the action potential quite a bit. Threshold of excitation is the value of membrane potential that must be reached to cause an action potential. So those seem kind of crazy. We're going to go into it a little bit more. All right, so where does the communication between neurons take place? This all occurs at the synapse. So the synapse is the junction between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron. And the synapse is the home to communication between neurons. So it's really good to remember, all communication between neurons takes place at the synapse. Neurons use neurotransmitters as a signal to communicate with one another there. And so the presynaptic and postsynaptic membranes, they face each other across the synapse. And then the synaptic cleft contains the extracellular fluid that the neurotransmitter diffuses in. So we got to remember these little areas. The synapse is shown in the picture right there. Okay, so we're going to keep going. So here is, I'm going to make sure this fits the screen. I'm going to make sure. Alrighty, so I want to start with this. We're going to have a terminal button from neuron A forms a synapse with a soma of neuron B. So the dendrites receive these signals from other neurons via the neurotransmitters. Molecules of the neurotransmitters then diffuse across the synaptic cleft through that extracellular fluid, and then they attach to the binding sites of postsynaptic receptors. And remember, the postsynaptic synaptors are located on the neuron, but they receive the messages. All right, and then this is going to be starting to create a chemical signal. So we're going to have some changes going on chemically. This binding that takes place can cause a direct method, and this is through the ionotropic receptors. And this opens the neurotransmitter-dependent ion channels, and they allow the passage of specific ions in and out of the cell. This is the only way for ions to enter the cell. So this is really important when it comes to, the changing and moving away from the resting potential and affecting the membrane potential. The movement of ions then changes the local membrane potential. So remember that the membrane potential is the difference in the electrical potential between the inside and outside of the cell. As you can see, the neurotransmitters really do make a really big impact chemically. So as the calcium channels open, the vesicles then fuse with the presynaptic membrane. They release these neurotransmitters. They communicate at the synapse. The neurotransmitters then bind with the postsynaptic receptors, which then begins the first phase of docking, and then they cause these ion channels to open. These ion channels then have their own binding site, which is why they're direct in the ionotropic receptors. It is not possible to have an action potential. That's not possible. It's all through the all or none law, which means the action potential occurs based on depolarization and electrostatic pressure. So you can't just have one. The combined effect of multiple dendrites is what changes the overall charge of the cell. So keep note of that. That's what can or cannot trigger this action potential to take place. And that occurs along the axon. All right, so action potential is what leads to this ion movement. The cell is depolarized, sodium channels open and sodium floods into the cell. The voltage-dependent potassium channels open, so it flows out of the cell. We have some sodium channels closing. The cell is charging. It's positively charged. So the potassium has to get out of there to reduce the membrane potential because it's positively charged with the electrostatic pressure, which is the attraction and repulsion of atomic particles. So this is going to make it more negative on the inside, so the potassium channels close, but not too much. And then hyperpolarized is making it more negative and below the resting potential. So this leaves time for the sodium-potassium transporters to start working, and then this prevents sodium from overtaking the inside of the cell, and so it kind of stabilizes the inside and outside of the cell. So you push out 3 sodium ions for every 2 potassium they push into the cell. And so here we go. The overall ion movement is really what leads to the sum of the signals. So as this movement is taking place with the sodium and the potassium and all this stuff, is the sum is positive, then it has this excitatory potential, which means there's going to be an increased likelihood that the postsynaptic neurons will fire. But if the sum is negative, then it has an inhibitory potential. So if there's that means there's going to be a decreased likelihood that the postsynaptic neurons will fire. So an example is if you open the sodium channels, it's going to depolarize and become excitatory. And if you open the potassium channels, that means it's going to hyperpolarize and it's going to be inhibitory. Okay, awesome. And then how can a change in the electron potential of the neuron A increase the firing rate of neuron B? So the action potential size stays constant as it moves down the axon. The only exception is if there's a solitary conduction, which speeds up the signal propagated down a neuron's action through myelinated axons. So this is the only way the action potential is not constant. The myelinated axons are axons surrounded by myelin sheath comprised of Schwann cells. So that's what it looks like right there. And then how does this kind of speed up the action potential? It's because these myelinated axons, the communication between nodes is faster among those myelinated axons. And so due to their protective barrier from extracellular fluids, it kind of speeds them up. Faster rate at which the axon can conduct an action potential. Those sodium channels open, they change an electrical potential at the nodes of Ranvier. This is all electrical. And then the electrical message gets smaller as it passes down the axon, the decremental conduction under the myelin sheath. It's still large enough though to trigger new action potentials at the next node though. So important to keep note of that. So really the action potential takes place along the axon. It's causing all these chemical and electrical changes, getting back to the membrane potential, the resting potential, because we really do want to stabilize through those transporting channels. That's what's so fun is the sodium potassium transporters are what those channels really stabilize the entire neurons and everything going on. So it kind of keeps those potentials going back to normal. And then here we are. That's what it's going to look like. Yeah, it takes place. It's important to note that it has to reach that threshold of excitation for the action potential to take place. So all those, this is what it looks like right there. And then this is the resources. All right, thank you.